Welcome to the state of our world, and we have a good discussion topic today. And this is a political discussion and a social discussion group. And with me is James Ash, and we will be discussing drugs and alcohol in America. So I'll turn it over. You had a question. What was your first question you had?
Yeah, before I launch into the questions, drugs, we all know that drugs are a serious problem in our society.
Right.
But I don't think we really fully understand to what degree that drugs. In fact, there are, and we're going to get into this discussion, we're going to find that there are some hidden drugs that's going on in our society, things that people just live with every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so today, I think before we launch into this, maybe we need to ask the question, what is a drug? And so as we were looking at this, I wanted to bring this up, Wikipedia. A drug is any chemical substance that causes a change in an organism's physiology or psychology when consumed. So any chemical substance, boy, that can be a lot of things. It can change who we are, both physiologically and psychologically. So now there's a lot of things, and perhaps our audience is looking at that and they're saying, wow, that can include, that's a pretty broad definition. Today we're going to start off by talking about illicit drugs.
Mm-hmm.
What is an illicit drug?
A drug that's illegal, you're talking about, and
Right.
something that our society does not approve of. And that may depend on the country you live in or the state you live in here in the United States now. What is illicit, what is not. And it's interesting, you're talking about drugs that change the way you feel, emotionally or psychologically. And I got to thinking about that, and there are a lot of things that make you feel better, and just about anything that makes us feel good could be habit forming.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because most people don't realize this, but our brain produces drugs.
That's true.
You have dopamine, you have epinephrine, norepinephrine, these drugs that the brain runs off of chemistry. And so because our brain operates on certain drugs, what we talk about in illicit drugs has a physiological, but not just a physiological, has a psychological effect, and it changes the chemistry of our brain.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that we can do to change the chemistry in the brain.
Right.
Just being out in the sunshine or exercising or
Right.
eating enough carbohydrates in
Right.
the diet, changes that.
So let me give you another example because, when you talk about cell phones, right? Like social media, people are so addicted to social media. You know why? Because there are companies who are trying to juice the mind. And what they're doing is they're programming these programs so that when something happens, there's a trigger event, something happens, it juices the mind, and the mind releases dopamine.
Yeah, it makes me feel good.
And makes me feel good.
Yeah.
That can be addictive. And that can be an addiction that is very powerful. And in fact, one of these companies that was working on that was called Dopamine Labs. That should be a clue right there that we've got drug addiction going on. Dopamine Labs, where they're trying to do that. Now, of course, drug addiction can be in all sorts of places, as we already looked. In social media, it can be in videos, that tend to excite, certain physiological things. And again, it's commandeering, it's taking hostage our chemical side of our brain to try to make it more addictive, more something that draws people in and holds them.
Yeah, you can, how about food?
Ooh.
I think some are addicted to sugar. or something, some
Yeah.
other type of food.
The
that,
three great things: sugar, salt, and fat.
Yeah.
Those three things. And by the way, this is kind of getting off subject a little bit, but these laboratories, just as surely as the social media is working to try to addict people on their whatever social media or computer game, that you also have these food companies who are trying to find that right chemistry to be able to grab the customer and to be able to draw them in. Wasn't it potato chips, Lay's potato chips? You just can't eat one. Again, they're taunting you, saying, "Hey,
Yeah.
you know what? You're going to be addicted to our product."
And
So,
it's interesting that the taste buds get used to a certain taste.
Yes.
And it takes about 20 days or so to get over that. Just like if you're addicted to salt.
right.
We're using the word addiction, but you have to have a lot of salt, and you quit that. After about 20 days, you don't have the desire anymore. The taste buds change about every 20 days. So it's interesting that people get hooked on even food items.
So drug addiction works off of the physiological and the psychological aspect of our human being. It's basically trying to commandeer, trying to hold hostage, and that's what can be so difficult to break. Now, let's go through some statistics here. How bad is the drug problem? Let's get back to the illicit.
Yeah.
This is what the law says. The law says you can't do these drugs. They are dangerous. They change the way that we think, that we act. And so let's talk about some of these illegal drugs. Let's give some examples of some of these illegal drugs, and how bad do we have this problem here in
How bad
America?
is it? Yeah, the National Institute of Health has an area called the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I think it's up on there on the screen that this is what they talk about. And there's a National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, and it says half the people 12 and older have used illicit drugs at least once.
Wow, that's shocking, because 12 years of age?
Yeah,
That's
getting-
exceptionally young.
they're getting started at a very young age.
Very young.
And you can get high just sniffing gasoline, or something.
Or glue.
Yeah, glue, or a lot of things. But then the next one that they brought out was that drug overdose deaths in the United States since 2000 are nearing 1 million. That's just since 2000.
Wow. And when we talk about the pandemic, because we just came out of a pandemic, I forget what the final tally was of how many people died, but I don't think that we crossed the 1 million mark. Did we? Do you remember or not? I can't
Yeah,
quite tell. But
that seems a little high to me, because we have about 130,000 a year dying of drugs, last I read. So, then when you include alcohol, is alcohol a drug?
Well, if we go back to the classical definition, coming back to that classical definition, any chemical substance that causes a change in an organism's physiology or psychology, do you think it affects our mind?
Well,
Oh, undoubtedly.
when I was in school, I started out in school, I can remember in 5th and 6th grade, they started talking to us about drugs and showing pictures about drugs. This was in public school. And they said that alcohol was a drug and
Absolutely.
tobacco was a drug
Absolutely.
at that time. And so I don't know why we don't deal with that more today. They're more worried about other things, but there are so many people involved in alcohol and drugs that they don't want to touch that
That's right.
in Congress.
They have a lot of lobbyists.
Yeah.
They're very powerful industry. And boy, you start to touch that industry, boy, people get worked up.
Yeah, even though they're spending a lot of money on it.
Yes.
And the next point was that the federal budget for drug control in 2020 was $35 billion.
That's billion with a B.
Yeah. $35 billion.
So just to put this in perspective, Alan, I just wanted to do a little thought experiment. If today we were to spend $1 a second, okay? $1 a second, and we were to go backwards in time, how far back do you think we would go to get to 35 billion?
Did you figure that out?
I did. And so I did a little calculation on my phone, just typed it all in. We would go back to 913 AD.
Yeah.
We're talking every single second. So every second,
I did some
it's
math.
$1. $1. And we would go back to 913 AD.
I did a little math myself. Took my what do you call it? I measured the thickness of a dollar bill with a mic, and it came to like 3/3,000ths of an inch. And then I said, if you stacked up dollars, tightly, like when you get a ream of paper, it's about the same thickness, and you stack them up like that tight, for $1 trillion, it would go around the world about 2.5 times at the equator.
A billion or a trillion?
Trillion.
A trillion. Wow.
And we spend trillions like they used to spend billions.
Oh, yeah. So here, I mean, $35 billion is a tremendous amount. And as far as I understand, that was in 2020.
Yeah.
So this is a huge drain on our national budget.
Right.
And really, this is problematic when we talk about this. Let's look at National Institutes of Health and give me some statistics here.
Yeah, there were 100 and real close to 107,000 drug-involved overdose deaths reported in the United States in 2021.
1 year.
Yeah, 1 year.
One
Now it's a little higher than that. That's 2021. Now it's up to about 130,000.
By the way, all the deaths in the Vietnam War didn't even amount to this. So what we're talking about is this is much greater of a tragedy than the Vietnam War, and not diminishing the Vietnam War. It was a terrible thing, but
then they lose something like 56 or 59,000.
Something along those lines. So you double that. That's what you're dealing with every single year.
And that's just the drugs. That's not counting alcohol.
Yes, that's illicit drugs.
Yeah. Synthetic opioids was the main driver of drug overdose deaths, with nearly 7.5 times the increase. The increase was 7.5 times what it was in 2015.
So from 2015 to 2021, you had a 7.5-fold increase. So, I mean, you look at that line. I mean, that line is just going like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Got a graph here we could put up showing this. And you can see there from 1999 to 2021. It's hard to get real recent data. You get 2022 maybe, but 2023, it's just projection.
Yeah.
But anyhow, from 1999 to 2021, you can see how it climbed. And this is overdose deaths.
Wow.
In the United States.
This is serious. Very serious stuff. And you look at that. Because these are not just sterile numbers. These are people. These are children. These are moms, dads. These are real. There are faces behind this bar graph.
And they're getting younger at it. And there are more male deaths than female deaths.
And why is that?
Drugs.
Why do you think? Why is it a man thing? You think it's a machismo?
Maybe the psychology is different. Maybe the changes in our society are driving them out on the streets and into gangs. And we talked about this when we talked about the family. but they were able to get a hold of these drugs out on the street.
Yeah. So let's look at January 2021. Drug overdose deaths exceeded homicides. Now, this is a surprising one.
Yeah.
Exceeded homicides. How much?
About 307%.
Wow.
That, in other words, there's 3 times as many drug overdose deaths as homicides.
So, when of course, you have these mass shootings, it hits the papers major time. And they see all the sad, people just mowed down. And usually, inevitably, after something like that, there's a lot of, heated discussion in Congress about, gun control and trying to make our society safer. But 306, almost 307% higher. This is much more of a serious. If we're going to put our eggs in the basket, we need to look at this issue and take a careful look. What can be done to address this issue?
Yeah, and you mentioned that they don't touch it in Congress. They're not going to touch alcohol, and they don't like to touch marijuana either. We'll
Right.
talk about that in a little bit.
It's become kind of it's becoming more socially accepted.
They do talk about the deaths by rifles.
Right.
Rifles are causing these deaths.
Right.
We've got to get rid of those, which are just like that compared to the number of deaths by drugs and alcohol. And yet they don't touch. In fact, the number of people killed with rifles is way less than the number of people killed with knives.
Really?
But you don't hear about it.
Yes.
So that's our media.
So let's talk about youth. Youth are growing up. The youth today are growing up in a very difficult circumstance. They are facing a lot of challenges, a lot greater challenges in many ways than the youth, let's say, of 50 years ago. Talk about drug overdose among youth. What kind of findings did the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, what are they saying?
Yeah, here's an article that they put out, and the next slide will show, it's a lot easier to read here. Drug overdose among youth. They're finding that 61% of 8th graders have used drugs.
So 6 out of 10, basically.
Yeah,
6
6
out of 10. You go to a public school, 6 out of 10, they've used drugs by the 8th grade.
Yeah. I don't think it was true when I was in the 8th grade. And I graduated with a class of like 850 8th graders in my class. I don't remember one that was using drugs.
Okay, so that's drugs. Let's talk about alcohol abuse. Because as we already mentioned, anything that changes the physiological person or your psychological mind is categorized as a drug. So clearly alcohol would be in that category.
Yeah, and it says that 62% of teenagers have abused alcohol.
Ooh.
And usually what they're talking about there is that they really get stoned. I mean, they really go under abuse of alcohol.
Right.
And 50% of teens have misused drugs.
These are huge numbers.
And in this study, they don't call alcohol a drug, but alcohol is a drug.
Absolutely.
Just as much as a cigarette.
Absolutely.
It's a drug.
Absolutely. And the very fact that they're not defining it as such is one of the most troubling parts. If they were to admit and say, yeah, it's a drug, we need to, whatever, we need to control it. But the very fact, the closest that they come is, written on the back of the beer trucks that say drink responsibly, because they realize that you can drink irresponsibly, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in some of the deaths caused by drinking.
Yes. What about Washington teens?
Yeah. Around 33%, at least 33, 36%, depending on whose study you're reading, 36% are more likely to have drugs in the last month. So they're likely to have used drugs in the last month, about 1/3 of our youth.
So 1 out of 3, 1, 2, 3, that one has used drugs in the last month.
And it says 61,000 kids between 12 and 17 used drugs in the last month. That gives you an idea of the number.
That's just in Washington state alone.
That's Washington.
That's Washington.
61,000 have used drugs in the last month. It's just our teens.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
What about marijuana?
and they say that it's almost 90% have used marijuana.
90?
So they're not calling that a drug?
Yeah, again, this is a very, it's interesting as time goes on. You know, it used to be back in Prohibition that they recognized the dangers of alcohol and they banned it. But then it became socially accepted. And then, and it used to be, of course, for a long time, marijuana, you know, was banned. But now it's kind of going the way of alcohol. It's becoming socially accepted in our society.
Yeah, a lot of these studies come from government studies. They're not private. They're government studies that they come out with this. But it's amazing. You know, we said that only 33% or a third have used drugs in the last month, but nearly 90% have used marijuana. They're experimenting.
Yeah. So clearly there's, and again, marijuana, just like alcohol, numbs the mind. It's a depressant, just like alcohol. It causes people to feel better about themselves and has that effect. So let's deal with the why. We've talked about the what, the statistics. Now let's launch into the whys. Why would a person go down this path? I mean, you can, you know, in the school, I remember back when I was in school, they had the Just Say No campaign, right? Just say no. And you know what? They found that campaign was an utter failure.
Yep.
You know, and they would go into schools and they would explain, you know, this is your brain on drugs, and you know, fry that egg and so on. It's very graphic and so on. Just say no. But did that work?
No.
Didn't appear to work very well. Why? Why, if people know that this is going to destroy me, this is going to put me into a very dark place, why even go there?
Well, we talked about that a little bit. One of the things is they want to get the feeling.
Right.
You know, I've experienced this, and I saw this. I had these hallucinations. You ought to try this. It's really cool.
Okay, so peer pressure, you know, curiosity, I think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Curiosity is one thing. And we're dealing with more psychological problems today than we've ever had. And the question is, are the drugs causing the psychological problems that we're seeing the increase of, or because of the psychology problems, are they taking more drugs? But they're linked together.
Yes.
And the suicide rate has gone out of sight.
I think in many situations, probably not in every situation, but in most situations, people are medicating pain. And if you've got psychological pain or physical pain or something, instead of thinking long-term solutions, instead of trying to think of how to address it in a healthy, wholesome way, they're trying to address a solution with a short-term Band-Aid. Instead of trying to find the long-term solution, they're just trying to get by. Very dangerous. And if anyone's watching this, if you're just trying to get by and you think that this is going to solve the problem, and you're thinking just in a short amount of time, dangerous. Don't start down that path.
You'd be surprised how many have social and they have social problems because of their peers. And I think that you mentioned the phone and all of the social media and their contacts, I think that's making it worse.
Yeah.
They're attacking each other. I was just reading about a boy that committed suicide because he got on his phone or on his computer and they want, send me some naked pictures or something, and then they use that. He said, I'm going to put this out all over the internet. I'm going to publicize this unless you give me so much money. and then he committed suicide.
Oh,
And so there are a lot of
tragic.
social problems, and some of them just go
Right.
on to the drugs.
Right.
These things are happening in their life, and they just start taking drugs.
Right. And they come from broken homes, fatherless homes. Many of these people, and we've looked at in a previous recording, talked about, what happens when a father is not present. Many of these young people, and we're talking about, young men, predominantly, I think 69% is illicit drugs. Because many of these young men who end up in institutions like the penitentiary come from fatherless homes. And so for those dads out there, your impact goes far beyond what you think that it might. It has an effect. Now let's talk about alcohol and drug accidents. Drugs and car accidents. What kind of statistics do we have here about how alcohol really has impacted the way that we drive?
Yeah. There was a study in the Traffic Safety Commission. This is again government, and they looked at just Washington. And it says 2022 saw the most traffic deaths on Washington roads since 1990. And according to the National Drug, how would you say it, organization, drugs or alcohol contributed to more than half of all fatal accidents from 2019 through 2021.
Wow.
So drugs and alcohol were involved. And even before Washington became how would you say it, before they legalized marijuana, there were a large part of the accidents and fatal accidents involved marijuana, even before it was legal.
Wow.
It says nearly 56% of people who died tested positive for drugs or alcohol. That's over half that died were tested positive. About 20% tested positive for 2 or more categories of alcohol, drugs. Yeah, and we have a lot of that on the road. That is scary. When you go out on the highway, you say, is somebody wanting to commit suicide today? Or would they be drunk coming my direction?
Yeah. I know in our family, there's around certain holidays, we just don't go out on the road. It's just safer. Not that, still the percentage of having an accident is still fairly small, but we just don't want to take on that risk.
I was talking to a guy just the other day, and he had come back from Tri-Cities. He was going home. He got 2 miles east of town, going out of Walla Walla, and he was going around 60, and a guy was coming the other way going 105 miles an hour drunk.
Wow.
Hit him head on. Just crossed over the line at the last second. Just about killed him.
Wow. He didn't die.
He didn't die. A lot of surgery and just fortunate things. And he claims that it was God who saved his life.
Oh.
But that's out there on the highway. And these people are drunk, and after midnight is probably the most dangerous time. Probably Saturday night after midnight, around 3 o'clock in the morning. They say that's when it's really dangerous.
Yeah. And that's tragic because, again, many of these people who are addicted to alcohol are addicted because, again, the alcohol fills the void. It fills the gap in their heart and helps them because they feel so sad because the life that they are living is not a life worth living. And so they have to prop themselves up with that alcohol so that they feel better. The problem is there are side effects.
Yeah.
And especially if you go out on the road, then not only are you just endangering your own health, you're endangering other people's health as well.
Yeah, and it's not always just drivers.
Right.
You got people, pedestrians, bicyclists.
Passengers.
Yeah.
Every person is involved. Right. So let's look at CDC government statistics for impaired driving. impaired driving, how many people are killed every day?
Well, it looks like you have something there. I'd like to see that.
So statistically, the CDC says 32 people in the United States are killed every day in car accidents involving an alcohol-impaired driver.
Yep.
This is one death every 45 minutes.
Yep. That's what it says.
That's shocking.
One death every 45 minutes.
Oh, sorry, 45 minutes. Did I say 45 seconds? Yeah, 45
No, every
minutes.
45 minutes somebody
45
dies.
minutes.
And it's because of alcohol. I once sold a home to a fella, and he was paraplegic. And this home had stairs in it. I was surprised he wanted it, and maybe he wanted it to get exercise. But I asked him how he got that way in a wheelchair. And he says, drunk driver. I felt really sorry for him, but that's the country we live in.
Yes. So let's talk about excessive alcohol use. How many people? How approximately every year? How many people die because of excess alcohol use?
Well, the USnews.com says that 140,000 people die every year because of alcohol.
Right.
Abuse of alcohol. And it says alcohol is to blame for 1 in 5 young adults' deaths in the United States.
So that's about 400 people a day.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, making some poor choices here.
So it's real high among young people because they don't die of old age; they die of
Tragic
alcohol,
accidents. Right.
My son had a best friend, and you can see out on the highway there a sign dedicated to him. Alcohol. He was killed, and he was just finished high school.
So there are deaths related to certain categories of people, and especially when we talk about young adults, right? Mm-hmm. Theoretically, you have to be 21 before you can legally buy alcohol, but everybody knows that there are people who aid and abet, underage people. But that when they talk about the category of alcohol-related deaths, they start with young adults because you have to, at least in this country, you have to be 21 years of age. I think up in Canada it was 18. But so how many people out of the young adult category, how bad is this? Well,
on the highway you're talking about?
Well, it says alcohol is to blame for, 1 in 5 young adults' deaths here in the United States.
Yeah.
And that comes from USnews.com, November 1st, 2022.
Yeah. And alcohol is not the only thing. Marijuana is becoming a big cause of fatal accidents in the United States.
Again,
and there's a mix sometimes. They take them both.
It impairs the mind. And so, yeah, like you said, you get this cocktail type, somebody's been drinking alcohol and then somebody else has a joint and they're passing it around and they're drinking. So now you're adding alcohol and cannabis on top of that. It's just it just hits. It's kind of like a 1-2 punch on the brain. And what happens is when alcohol hits the brain and cannabis hits the frontal lobe, what happens is it wipes out the critical thinking right here. The judgment. And so people make stupid decisions. Why? Because physiologically you've wiped out that critical thinking part, the critical processing unit of your brain.
Yeah.
And I remember one time my brother and I were driving somewhere and we happened to be listening, I don't know, to National Public Radio, I forget what it was, but they had a call-in show. No, it was AM radio something. and this person was calling in, and they were saying, just call in and tell over the radio. I'd never do this. Call and tell over the radio the most embarrassing or silly thing you've ever done. And I was shocked. My brother and I looked at each other as caller after caller went on live radio and told how they had been drinking, and when they drank alcohol, they did all these foolish things. And again, it was a real wake-up call for both my brother and I. Like, you know what? If you don't want to do something absolutely stupid, don't drink.
Yeah, it does. It affects the judgment. It affects your eyesight. They start seeing double. And you can always tell one that's really drunk because they weave a little bit. They start slowing down early. And in fact, they're probably not as dangerous as the guy that's had 2 or 3 beers and is overconfident going 105 miles an hour.
Yeah.
But you can tell that the judgment is affected, their vision is affected. Right. I can remember when I was working in a shop one time, and I saw this drunk walking down the sidewalk, and he was going from one parking meter to the next, and he'd eye up the next, he'd grab one, he'd eye up the next one, and he'd walk for that one and catch it. And I think he must have caught the double because there was nothing there, and I heard his head hit the concrete.
Ooh.
And I thought, man, this is really sad.
Yeah.
I've seen drunks. I just say to myself, how can people do this to themselves?
Yeah, you talk about weaving around on the road. One day I was coming back. I'd played basketball and I played my heart out. And as I was driving back home, all of a sudden I see these lights behind me. A state trooper pulls me over, and he comes up with his flashlight. It was dark. It was flashlight, and he's like, "Can I see your license?" So I give him his license. "Mr. Ashe seems to be having a hard time staying between the lines. Is there a reason for that?" And I knew immediately what he was driving at. So I said, "Sir, I just played a lot of basketball." And so he very quickly sized up the situation and said, "Well, try to drive a little more straight."
Yeah, I've known guys that became Christians later.
Yeah.
But before they became a Christian, one of them said, "Yeah, you know, I can remember pulling up to the stop sign and falling asleep at the stop sign." And the other one said, "Yeah, I hit on a concrete abutment, and I went a little further, and I saw one of my wheels roll off over the edge of the road."
Oh my!
And he was driving drunk.
Yeah,
it's bad. It's the safety. According to the Governor's Highway Safety Association, 43.6% of fatally injured drivers, that's about half, in 2016 tested positive for drugs.
Wow. Yeah.
And over half of them, they had more than one drug in their body.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit in our discussion here. Let's talk about something that most people don't even give a second thought to, and that's caffeine.
Yeah.
Now, again, our definition is a drug is something that affects us physiologically or psychologically.
Yeah, it makes us feel better.
It makes us feel better. Now, I would argue that caffeine does actually both of those. It affects us physiologically. In other words, we don't feel quite as tired. And that's, I think, for a lot of people, the first thing they do when they wake up is, "Where's my cup of coffee?" Because I got to get a kickstart my day. But it also affects you psychologically. If you've ever tried to take a critical test, especially when you've been drinking caffeine, just forget it. You're not going to do very well. And because it impairs our mind.
Yeah.
And so, but again, socially accepted? Oh, you go to certain churches. They got the coffee bar, the espresso, and everything is out there. It's just totally all but baptized into a lot of churches.
An espresso is really high in caffeine.
Yeah.
It's about Well, it can run about 190 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
But we have the American Heart Association also talks about caffeine and what it does to the body. And it takes a lot of caffeine to really do damage or kill somebody.
Right. But
I
it's
mean,
possible. People
yeah.
have died through overdose of caffeine.
Yeah, and they say that it's between 90 and 93% of U.S. adults that consume caffeine every day. 90 to 93%.
Yeah, that's 9 out of 10. That's huge.
Yeah.
If I got 93% on a test, I was pretty happy.
Yeah, and most of it comes through coffee.
Right.
But when they get into some of these drinks,
Right.
some of
Energy
these
drinks.
drinks can have like 700 milligrams or 800 milligrams of caffeine.
Red Bull, Dynapep,
Yeah.
some of these ones that are just like give you that shot.
And now there are powders and tablets,
Right.
and that's what's killing people. We don't know whether some of those are suicides or whether they just put too much in. But you get up to around 10,000 milligrams,
Mm-hmm.
and you probably will die. There are a few people that have died in the hospital with a couple thousand milligrams, but that's rare. They had some other issue. So this American Heart Association says, well, a cup a day, it's probably not going to be too noticeable, but you get up to 10 or 12 cups a day, and you're going to be damaging your health. It's serious.
And again, if we know that there's no medicinal benefit, why I look at it, Alan, like it's a credit card. Oh, we could have a whole discussion about credit cards and stuff like that. But credit card is you're using tomorrow's money today.
Yeah.
You're using tomorrow's money today. Caffeine is a credit card. You're using tomorrow's energy right now. And that's the problem, is that your body is really saying, I need sleep.
You're borrowing from your future.
You're borrowing from your future, and you're wearing yourself out your life forces. And that's a problem.
There's another thing. There's some side effects we've
Yeah, let's
brought
talk
up
about
here.
those.
Decreased ability to absorb nutrients, especially iron,
Ooh.
sleep problems.
So you can become anemic by drinking coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Slow digestion. People have problems with ulcers, irregular heartbeat. We know that's true.
Mhm.
Panic attacks, dehydration because your water tends to leave your body faster when you're using caffeine. And there are things like fatigue, because you don't get to sleep.
Right.
Some people lay there for 2-3 hours trying to get to sleep at night.
Right.
And
So
those
it can
are
work
side
both
effects.
ways. It can stimulate you to the point where you can't sleep when you need to sleep, or on the flip side, when your body is just about to crash, and then you just keep pressing forward, and your body's like, I need sleep, I need sleep, I need sleep.
Yeah, I had a friend, and he says his wife drank a lot of coffee, all day long. And I noticed that she was very irritable. It didn't take much to set her off.
Right. Triggered easily.
And you better duck.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Something's flying your way.
And I thought at the time, I can see where taking too much caffeine could be a problem with character. In other words, a Christian could end up going across to the other side simply because they're so sensitive and they get angry, and the emotional part is just unstable. And a Christian shouldn't be that way.
Again, it's subtle, though, because it's so socially accepted
Yeah.
in our society. And again, anything that wipes out the frontal lobe of the mind is a problem, because that's how God speaks to our hearts. He speaks to us through the frontal lobe of the mind. Anything, and mark this down, Alan, anything that the devil is trying to promote in our society is going to, in some way, affect our minds.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we talked about drugs most of your drugs that you get hooked on, you have withdrawal symptoms when you try to get off of them. Caffeine has those withdrawal symptoms. And
just like alcohol does.
yeah,
too.
you get headaches, fatigue, muscle pain. Some people get a mild runny nose, sweating, anxiety.
Right.
Just trying to get off of caffeine.
Right.
So it's an addiction.
It is. It
And
is.
People get, it's just like trying to get off of cigarettes or
Right.
something else. It's
Or
just hard.
heroin or alcohol. Again, it's all interrelated.
You mentioned alcohol. It's interesting to note that people that are taking high caffeine and drinking together, they tend to drink a lot more.
Ooh.
They've
there's
done
this-
a study on this,
Yeah.
and they tend to do binge drinking when they're taking caffeine at the same time as drinking
Right.
alcohol.
Yeah. Well, let's shift again and let's talk about the Bible. Because the Bible won't talk about illicit drugs. The Bible will never say one time anything about marijuana, but again, the principles, we're looking at principles of what the Bible talks about, and alcohol has been here since, essentially since the time of Noah.
Yeah.
And probably even before. But you have examples in the Bible of people who used alcohol, and I can't find one example of someone who absolutely became drunk and it spoke of it in a positive way.
Right.
But there's all sorts of examples of those people who drank alcohol. We talked about Noah. Noah drank alcohol and took off all of his clothes. His son saw it and became cursed. You had Lot.
Yep.
Lot, of course, after he had lost his entire household was destroyed in Sodom and Gomorrah. He escaped up to the mountains. On the way, his wife turned back, looked, became a pillar of salt. He gets up to the mountains, and having lost everything, his daughters make him drunk.
Yep. They got him into
and
it.
start two of the nations that became enemies of the Israelites. And so, again, drinking alcohol is never spoke of in a positive way. But let's look at Proverbs 23, verse
Yes. Read
30.
that. Read that one.
Okay? Those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine, do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. Yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of a mast, or like a pole, right? Saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake, that I may seek another drink?
Yeah, when it's talking about the top of a mast, a boat in water, when there were waves, that mast would go back and forth like this.
There you
And
go.
they're saying, I feel like go back and forth, no balance.
Exactly. So here we find this is clearly speaking of a drunk person who,
Yeah.
once he's done drinking, he's like, where's my next drink? And the tragic part is that it affects how we live our life. It affects our mind. How many people who have a problem with alcohol are just really happy? They're like, I just love the fact that I overdrink. Usually people do it and they're caught in this trap and they can't get free. That's why we have AA,
Yeah.
Alcoholics Anonymous, and we also have Narcotics Anonymous, and a bunch of these other ones, because it has become an addiction in our society, and people are trying to break free.
Yeah, and the Bible says, don't look at wine in the cup when it's red and bites like an adder. In other words, when it has that alcoholic content, it says don't take it. Go ahead. What else do you have there?
Proverbs 20, verse 1, wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler. Whoever is led astray by it is not wise.
Yeah.
So you want to be wise? Do you want to be smart? You want to be intelligent? I think I want everything going for me.
You know, somebody came to me one time and they said, you know, in the New Testament, you really can't tell when it's talking about alcoholic or non-alcoholic wine, and that's true. The word is oinos in
Right.
Greek,
Hmm.
and it's just a commercial name for anything that came from the grape. And they said, well, show me in the Bible, in the New Testament, where you shouldn't drink wine. And I said, well, let's set the Bible aside and you tell me what's good about drinking alcohol.
Hmm.
But the truth is, even in the Bible, in the New Testament, you can see cases where they talk against drunkards.
Right.
No drunkard will enter the kingdom of God.
That's right.
And in drugs, Jesus didn't want to even take what they gave him on the sponge,
Right.
because it would affect his clearness
Sour
of thought.
wine. Sour wine. It was not the fresh, the grape juice. Very clearly it says sour. It had fermented.
Yeah, and he didn't want his judgment affected,
Mm.
or his ability to resist temptation.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that tell us about drinking alcohol? Does it affect your ability to resist temptation?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, how many people have started a pregnancy because they were drinking?
Right.
That happens over and over.
Right. Or they became angry. They
Yeah.
drank alcohol, and they got into a fight, killed somebody. They're spending the rest of their life in jail.
Yeah, I ran into a guy in prison, a great big guy. I said, "How'd you get in here?" And he says, "Drinking." And he says, "I was in a bar and there was a brawl that started, so I took two guys and knocked their heads together and killed them both."
Tragic.
And my son, I took my son with me to the prison, prison ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "A lot of my friends drink." And this old timer there said, "Hey, son, let me tell you, that's how I got in here. Leave it alone."
Hmm.
So the guys in
Wow.
prison realized that
Yeah.
that's how they got there.
Yep. Proverbs 23, verse 21. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe a man with rags. When my wife were out in the jungle of South America, down there they didn't buy it, they made it.
Yeah.
Out of the Cossack, they made it out of cassava, and then they fermented it. I won't tell you how. It's just absolutely despicable. But
Yeah,
they would
yeah,
make this
I know.
soan, and they got it fermenting. This guy came to my wife and said, "I want to break free, but I can't." Literally, his family was in rags, and they were drinking. They were literally abject poverty. They weren't eating very well.
And it's interesting that people who are on marijuana have the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking a lot of marijuana, and you say alcohol. A lot of these drugs, they do something to the person to
Yes.
make them not care about
Right.
what's happening to their family. They don't want to go to work.
Yeah, they
They
called it the do-nothing drug.
Just don't care.
You take the drug and you don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 6, verse 10. Nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God.
Right.
And the Bible says, and such were some of you. And isn't that wonderful? It doesn't, yes, perhaps, in the past we had those tendencies, but the Bible says that when we are in Christ, we don't go down those paths. And it's very clear that in the earth made new, when Jesus comes back, we're not going to be involved with this sort of behavior.
Right. I can't imagine people in heaven getting drunk.
Exactly.
I don't think it's going to happen. And it is amazing how, in today's world, I look at these people out on the streets, homeless.
Yeah. Sad.
And
Tragic.
most of them are selling drugs, dealing in drugs. They're getting drunk, and they have no desire to get a job.
Right.
And some of them, their mind has been so affected that they can't hold a job anymore. In
Right.
fact, the marijuana, if you do studies on marijuana, a lot of our younger people are using it, high school and so forth. They say up to the age of 25, these are studies done by the government, the brain is affected and does not fully develop.
Right.
So it stops the development, the ability to learn,
Right.
if they're taking that
And that's
in
the
high school.
that's the tragic part of the youth, is their brains are still growing. Now, the good news is that research shows that there is a certain level of neuroplasticity. We thought that, brains can't heal themselves. Well, there is some sense that they, over time, living in the right way,
Yeah.
that's the key, living in the right way according to God's plan, that the brain can, over time, find healing. Ephesians 5, verse 18, do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit.
Yes.
Not the spirits, but the Holy Spirit.
That's a good one. Not the spirits, but the Spirit.
That's right.
That's very good. And I think about these texts in the Bible when it talks about a drunkard. I don't know too many people who have been social drinkers that have not been really soused sometime in their life.
Mm.
And some people have it, I think, maybe in their background, maybe genetically, they're more susceptible. I know my father was in World War II, and with all those soldiers and everything. And one time I asked him about drinking, and he said, I can't drink, because if I started drinking, I'd be an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I just can't touch it. He knew that he was one of them. And so I think there are some weaknesses there, but it's like playing Russian roulette. You take and you put one shell in a gun, you spin the chamber, you put it up to your head and pull the trigger. That's like starting to drink. How do you know whether you're going to become a drunkard or not?
Yeah.
You're playing Russian roulette
Right.
with your salvation there.
It's just like fentanyl. Fentanyl is another one. We didn't even touch on that, but fentanyl is now the new drug that's being laced in all of the other drugs as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's very cheap, but fentanyl is literally Russian roulette.
Mm-hmm.
And to the degree that now in American Indian societies, they're now starting to come out with these detox packs that they're putting out there because they got a serious problem, so that if somebody overdoses, they can get them off of this without losing them. But this is one of the reasons why the graph is going up. And as we wrap up here, and as we talk about drugs, again, let's kind of finish off where we began, is that a drug, again, is something that affects us physiologically or psychologically.
Yes.
And so that broad definition should cause us all to stop and think, what are the drugs in my life?
Yeah. And
What are the things that are triggering me, causing me to have having a negative impact physiologically or psychologically?
Yeah.
And
So-
it's negatively impacting, because that fits into the category of a drug.
Mm-hmm. And we said too that anything that makes you feel good, chemical that makes you feel good, is probably addicting.
Well, it can be. Not that, God gave us these dopamine. I mean, I'm sure glad that I have, the chemistry that I have in my mind. When you climb to the top of a mountain, and you get to the top and you're like, yeah, you get that shot of having accomplished something. And so those are good things. God did that on a purpose,
Yeah.
And
a runner, people that run a lot.
people who run.
I mean, they're addicted to that chemical that it's putting
Right.
into the body, and it's
Right.
good. It's
And when
not
you're-
bad, but it's good.
A husband and a wife, there's in that relationship, there are moments in which you have that experience of, and God made it to be great. God intended it. But again, what Satan is trying to do is he's trying to change the mind.
Yeah.
Because if he can change right here, he can affect us eternally.
Right. I think maybe it's time to wrap this up.
Yes.
Say, thank you for watching today. We've discussed drugs and drug problems in the world, and maybe it'll have some effect on your life, or you'll be able to deal with one of your children or grandchildren and help them out. So thank you for watching the program today. I have no idea how long we went.